Scientists and Engineers group expects organizers and participants alike to contribute to a harassment-free environment for all. And while attending a NextGen event, workshop, networking function, online forum, chat room, social media, or other NextGen related activities, organizers and participants should not engage in harassment in any form. As a group, we aim to share ideas in freedom of thought and expression, and it is essential that the interactions between members within and others outside of the group take place in an environment that recognizes the inherent worth of every person being respectful of all.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think we'll get started and I'll introduce our speakers today. So our first speaker is Professor Carle Pieters. She received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD at MIT in planetary science, and she holds a distinguished scientist position at the Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute, or Ravy, and she's a professor at Brown University. Her research focuses on remote compositional analysis and surface processes. She has been a productive lunar and asteroid astronomer, as well as a science team member on several exploration missions to the moon and asteroids. She was the PI of the Moon Mineralogy Mapper, or M-Cubed, on the Indian Chandrayaan-1 mission to the moon, and an active co-I on Dawn. And she is currently a co-I on Trailblazer, a NASA small mission to the moon to study lunar volatiles. Our next speaker is Professor Jim Head. He is the Louis and Elizabeth Shirk Distinguished Professor at Brown University. He earned his undergraduate degree from Washington and Lee University and his PhD from Brown in 1969. From 1968 to 72, while serving at NASA, he participated in the selection of landing sites for the Apollo program and in astronaut training and geology and surface exploration. He also was involved in planning and evaluating experiments to be deployed on the moon, in mission operations during the lunar surface exploration, and in preliminary analysis of samples. He continues to be involved in the training of astronauts and has been involved in many national and international space missions and received several awards and commendations for his service. So I think we'll get started with Jim first. I think Jim has some slides to show everyone to just introduce some of his thoughts on the Apollo program. Take it away, thanks.
That look okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's great.
Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation, and I hope this is not going to be the last of these sessions, because this is a really very, very iterative kind of discussion, and this is exactly maybe the first lesson and the first feed forward from Apollo is that's exactly the way it was in Apollo. Lots of discussion, lots of interactions, and that's what made, I think, it was such an important program. So I want to start out by saying that there's a lot of things to think about, and I think the first is that we're actually forward to the moon and onto Mars together. This is really important. It's been over 50 years. It's hard for me to believe that, but it has been over 50 years. We've just celebrated the last few years all the incredible accomplishments of the sequential Apollo missions, and I'll just touch on those briefly. But the key is that we're going forward. Okay, we're going forward. We're not going back to the moon. We're going forward to the moon, and we're going on to Mars. We're not just using it as a lily pad. We are, in fact, beginning and continuing robust surface lunar exploration, and we will stay there. Okay, that's critical. And then we're going to use that experience to go on to Mars, and that's also critical because all the Apollo astronauts will tell you that if we're going to go to Mars with humans, they need to do their geological field training. Okay, Arizona, Hawaii, like we did in Apollo, etc. But also they're going to have to do their geological field training on the moon. Okay, so that's a new field area, and that's going to be what the future looks like. So how do we go forward, if you will? So I want to talk about some perspectives, and I think some really important things to think about is guidelines for Apollo transfer of knowledge. There's some great comments. George Santayana said, "Those who ignore the history are doomed to repeat it." And of course, Kurt Vonnegut, bless his heart, I've got news from Mr. Santayana. That's what it is like to be human, because we just simply, there's this thing called institutional and cultural amnesia. We forget what we did and we try to reinvent the wheel. We don't learn lessons, etc. That's what it is to be human. We make the same mistakes again and again. We don't need to do that, but we commonly do that. And I think the key is we're not going to do Apollo again. That's just absolutely no question. I think both Santayana and Vonnegut are right there. But to me, the words to go by are Mark Twain's. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So what are some of the themes here? That's what I want to try to outline today as a basis for our continuing discussions here. What are some of the themes that we can carry forward from Apollo to Artemis as perspectives? So here's a couple of perspectives that I want to share with you just up front, because these kind of like these truths are self-evident, but they're really not sometimes. So first, Apollo was not just flags and footprints. I've heard that in senior NASA circles, oh, we're not doing Apollo, that was just flags and footprints. Disabuse yourself of that, because that was not what it was at all. It was flags, there were footprints, but it was incredibly much more than that. Secondly, it was not just Apollo 11, it was the Apollo Lunar Exploration Program, Apollo 7 to 17. Incredible amount of information came from each one of these missions, and each one is a jewel in terms of exploration and understanding and science and engineering synergism, and they're really important to learn from. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 were really Lewis and Clark type scientific expeditions to the moon. You know, you will see in a minute that they traversed over significant distances, brought back huge amounts of return samples, and accomplished a whole series of experiments, et cetera. So that's important too. These were not just like little landing, et cetera, but no, they were expeditions, extremely well planned, well thought out, goals and objectives, and the return on the investment was huge. Fourthly, the Apollo lunar exploration scientific legacy revolutionized scientific and human perspectives of the Earth, its history, and its place in the solar system and in the cosmos, okay? And it's really important to think about the scientific legacy of exploration. It helps if you go in with scientific goals and objectives. And indeed, we have done that with Artemis, and we're continuing to do that. But keep asking, what will be the Artemis legacy? What is the end game here? And what do we want to accomplish so that we can pave the steps on the way to that? Fifthly, Artemis is a moon to Mars architecture, not an Apollo lunar exploration program. This is a really critical difference to keep in mind at all times, because the Apollo lunar exploration program was kind of pyramidal in a classic sense. It's a program, it had very tight organization, et cetera. And Artemis is an architecture. There are a lot of pieces, et cetera, but it's not a program. And it's a big difference. And you need to keep thinking about how all these pieces come together. I was a systems engineer when I first started at NASA. I had no idea what a systems engineer was. I'd never had a course in engineering, but I was one. And it simply is thinking your way through to the moon and back. And that's what you need to do. You need to integrate at all times. So that's another important difference to keep in mind. So the Apollo scientific goals and objectives, I mean, the key here was that the Apollo program, of course, it was funded and motivated by competition with the Russians, with the Soviet Union, no question about that. We never would have gone just on the independent ideas of science alone. But once it was started, science was fundamental throughout, okay? And the goal was to broadly understand the nature, internal structure, and history of the moon and its environment. And there was four-pronged approaches from that. The surface science stations, these were known as the ALSEP and other experiments. Surface exploration, this was astronauts on the surface and deployment of geophysical instruments, et cetera. Thirdly, orbital exploration. The astronauts, one astronaut remained in orbit and was making incredible observations, and there was a whole scientific instrument module bay in the later missions, which got tons of different experiments and tons of different data back. And the moon was used as a platform, Lyman alpha telescopes, gravity wave experiments, et cetera, to literally use the moon as a platform. There was a huge range of science at all levels during Apollo. And I think that's really important to remember, because we want to make sure we don't step back after 50 years, but we learn from that. What do we do? What was worked best? What can we improve? What have we learned in 50 years that we can optimize? So this is all important too. So I worked at NASA headquarters from 1960, 68, somewhere in there, to 73. This was my job, and this wasn't just my job. I didn't do these things independently. I did these things in concert with a huge number of other people. So the first thing was, what questions do we address when we go to the moon? What's the exploration strategy? Where do we go to implement that strategy? Landing site selection. Well, okay, what do we do when we get there? Traverse planning. We had to plan traverses and figure out how to turn scientific goals and objectives into accomplishments and mission plans. How do we implement the science goals and objectives? Science and engineering synergism. This is a critically important point too, which is we worked every day, shoulder to shoulder with the engineers. We didn't know their language initially. They didn't know ours. We learned their languages mutually. And that was incredibly important for us accomplishing all the goals in Apollo, the scientific goals and objectives. Secondly, ninth, whatever the hell is here, how do we train test pilots? These were very highly motivated students. Trust me, very highly motivated. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to accomplish, et cetera. And how do we train test pilots to be geologists and observers? Okay. Fortunately, we had Jack Schmidt there, who was throughout, and he was instrumental in making sure that the training involved people like Lee Silver from Caltech, et cetera, and really was a major factor in actually making the astronaut training what it turned out to be. How do we practice? Well, what do we do? We have to do mission simulations. What about the actual missions? Well, we were in mission control in Houston during the mission operations, and we worked to figure out what we do in the back room and how we help the crew on the surface and what that relationship looks like. And then, of course, there's the feedback. Once they get back, we did post-mission debriefings and analysis, and then, of course, the feed forward, which is replanning of subsequent missions. So it's hard for me to believe, but in fact, we flew 11 human missions in 50 months. That's one per 4.5 months. If I'd had frequent flyer miles, if they existed during that time, I would have permanent first class seats to Pluto and back, but they didn't, okay? Nonetheless, the first 4 missions were precursors to Apollo 11 on July 16th, 1969, and you all know subsequently that the continuing Apollo missions through 17 were really increasing in their capability. And the key here is at each step, and I'd love to come back to talk to you, for 40 minutes or something like that on this whole sequence here. What did the science and engineering goals do to enhance science exploration return? Of course, the first one, Apollo 11, land safely to deploy experiments, collect rocks and soils and return safely, okay? But each step here is a major step. Increase stay time on the surface, increase number of EVAs to 2, demonstrate pinpoint landing to increase access, provide equipment tools, enable orbital plane change. By the yellow ones here are all the ones that happen in the J missions. That's Apollo 15, 16, and 17. Get out of the equatorial zone, go to the highlands like Apollo 15 site at Hadley Apennine, increase EVAs to 3, provide mobility to reach distant targets. Let's put a car on the moon. Working with the engineers, okay, these things were really discussed and implemented, and they were excited to help the scientists because we worked shoulder to shoulder with each other. Send a geologist as a member of the surface crew. Apollo 17, Jack Schmidt. I mean, he was superb, of course. He's a geologist, okay? And he helped train the other astronauts as well as, and absolutely fantastic. And then we were even going to send a roving vehicle to the next landing site with Apollo 18 and 19 and 20. To rendezvous with the next landing site. So each step of the way, there was an improvement with each mission. And that's a critical thing to remember because that's going to be important here too. And here you can see the benefits of those, okay? So shown on the left is a diagram which has a kind of bullseye there with each of the Apollo landing sites centered on there, or at least centered at the landing site on there. And you can see here, each one of these is a kilometer radius circle increasing there. And you can see that the range got out to, almost 14 kilometers, okay? And sure, rovers like Lunokhod 1 and 2, they exceeded that, as do rovers on Mars today. But this is really amazing. Look what the increase in capability did. In the left-hand diagram, you cannot even see Apollo 11 at this scale, okay? I'm not denigrating that at all, but you can't even see Apollo 11 at this scale. So if you look to the right, you can see the traverse distances. Apollo 11, 12, and 14 were constrained by the walkback distance and by not having any mobility. So they did a lot. You can see it increasing with experience out to about 3 or 4 kilometers. But the rover, I mean, my gosh, look what that did. It took us out to over 30 kilometers, okay? 30 kilometers, okay? And then if you take a look at the surface samples return, they did an excellent job on 11, 12, and 14, somewhere around 40 kilos or less. But the advent of the rover to be able to carry the samples and be able to traverse more distance and do more sampling in a certain period of time and increase the EVAs got out to over 100 100 kilometers, 100 kilos of return samples. So this is really amazing. And this is an illustration of what, in fact, we should be striving for, because this is what Apollo essentially experienced really enabled us to do. So the legacy of Apollo and perspectives for Artemis, Apollo is really the cornerstone for understanding planets. It's really clearly that way. We know so much about it, and yet there's so much to learn. And that's an extending legacy for, in fact, Artemis. But we need to be thinking about that. You all need to decide and be very, very careful to ensure that the legacy you want to have for the moon and the planets is fulfilled. So let me close with a couple of comments here, some general perspectives, if you will. So the first thing is, like Apollo, the Artemis program will be evolutionary, absolutely evolutionary. Early Artemis missions are, we'll be relearning how to explore the moon with humans, launch vehicles, new transportation systems. All these kinds of things are new, new astronauts, new suits, new and very extreme illumination conditions, all sorts of things going on there. So this is going to be really interesting, and it's going to be a challenge to you. We faced a lot of these in Apollo, and we're happy to try to help in any way there. The second thing is the misnomer of mission control. Mission control is a good way to think about it is think about it as an American football analogy. The team is on the field, okay? The quarterback calls the plays, sidelines, and deeper backup give input. You have timeouts, you have half times, et cetera, for discussions between EVAs, et cetera. But the team is on the field, and the quarterback, the commander, is generally calling the plays. You want to be sure your consumables aren't running out. So you have a whole back room there of people in mission control who are not controlling everything. They are, in fact, monitoring what's going on and giving you advice about timing and so on to optimize your performance and time on the moon. 30, how to prepare the team on and in the field, and that is on the moon. You really need to, in Apollo, we had this kind of like concept of TQ, train them, trust them, and turn them loose. We spent a lot of time with them in the field. We built up really good relationships with them, and the managers and the mission controls and the flight directors, et cetera, in the field. And then we trusted them. So when they went to the moon, we turned them loose, if you will. And so that's train them, trust them, turn them loose. And that's critically important because of situational awareness. They are going to be on the moon. They will have absolutely the best situational awareness. And they will be the ones who are able to call the shots and really be able to understand, what the optimal things to do. You're always there to help them in mission control, but don't turn it into a kind of like top down, okay, hold up that rock. Let me see if you should take that. What do you think, gang, back here in Houston? Yeah, wait a minute, turn it around a little bit. No. You're wasting their time. And a critical way to understand that and think about is, in fact, Krikolev's law. Sergei Krikalev is one of the brightest cosmonauts I've ever met. Amazing guy, Soviet cosmonaut, Russian cosmonaut. And his paper, which I encourage you to read, is Creativity versus Determinism, okay? And that's really important because his point is you can't just pass up a bunch of instructions. That's determinism. You need to unleash the brain's creativity. And so that's really important to understand. Please read that paper. The fourth point is we're training for Mars. So we have to practice crew autonomy. This is another reason why situational awareness is so important. We're not going to be able to tell them what to do. When they hold up that rock on Mars, that was 15 minutes ago. We're not going to be able to tell them anything. So we really need to practice for feed forward there. Another point here, and I just have two more slides here, is that the global context of the South Circumpolar region. I'm fond of saying at this point that we're not in Kansas anymore. If you remember Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, whoa, okay, even Toto was clear about that. So we're really outside. This is great because we're outside of the Apollo Luna Chang'e area. And so that's great because there's so much to learn there. We just have all sorts of things here. And this is really the legacy to really understand the fundamental process of magma ocean, subsequent impacts. All these things will be able to be attacked through exploration of the South Circumpolar region. But we're not in Kansas anymore. We really need to be thinking about things like Apollo 16 site, about other sites, about traverses in the highlands and areas that we only touched on in Apollo. Jack Schmitt explored the base. Dave Scott explored the base of the mountains. They have really important information to tell you about how it works. Okay, so keep that in mind and think about this for what the implications are for Artemis site selection and exploration strategy. And I want to encourage you also to read two other papers, which we've recently finished. The second one is in review right now. It's in revision right now, review and revision. So these are a South Circumpolar geological map featured here. And then we've dated hundreds of units in that area, the South Circumpolar region, and looked at the stratigraphic sequence and done stratigraphic columns, like you can see in the lower right-hand diagram. So these are all really important too. So finally, key things here, guidelines for Artemis. Study EVAs and surface operations, the foundational pyramid. Science and engineering synergism. Work shoulder to shoulder with engineers. Listen to the Apollo 15, 17 voice recordings and transcripts. The Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, which is online and totally available, is absolutely fantastic for that. You learn from that. You learn from what it was like. You learn from what the problems were. You learn from how you might correct them with Artemis. Evolutionary, the first Artemis mission will not be, essentially a scientific expedition, but we want to work towards those, okay? South Circumpolar planning, you're in the highlands, think Apollo 16 in the highlands, incorporate robotic rovers. NASA is doing this because you're not going to be able to get to all these different places with human exploration and human rovers. You're really going to require the complement of human and robotic partnership. Situational awareness, encourage T-cube, train them, trust them, turn them loose, avoid meddling, okay? They'll let you know. Guidelines are good. Briefings, debriefings are good between EVAs and so on. Remember Krikolev's law, respect and encourage creativity and fight determinism. When Dave Scott came back from the moon, he took me aside and he said, Jim, I had so much fun doing the geology at Apollo 15 that I didn't even know I had my spacesuit on. That's what you want to be able to have the crew say when they come back. Murphy's Law, if something can go wrong, it will. Lots of time went in Apollo and contingency planning. We didn't know whether the rover would work and so on and so on. And we're heading to Mars, so we'll have no real-time support. So T-cubed, train them, trust them, turn them loose is absolutely required. So I hope these guidelines are good for opening up questions, etc. I'm so excited about Artemis. And I hope that the Artemis next generation will continue the dialogue with us into the future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that valuable insight, Jim. I think we'll hear from Carle now if you have any thoughts about what Jim said and your opinions on the Apollo program and moving forward.
No, that was a great overview, Jim. And I was just going through it. I have to tell you a little Jim Head story. I was in graduate school when Jim was doing this, and I was at MIT, and Jim would come up with this wonderful, huge
mega briefcase
of photographs that they had just gotten, and we'd all huddle around it. And for the longest time, he was working at Belcom at the time. It was Jim Head of Belcom is coming. Jim Head of Belcom is coming. And I thought he was the head of Belcom. And since then, we've been great friends and colleagues for quite a while. And the enthusiasm, as you can tell, is still there and is infectious. So that's something that I will continue to treasure. Let's see if you could put up the reading list slide that I had, because that's the only thing I really thought to prepare for this and wanted to give some of the new people who are coming into lunar science a little bit of guidelines in terms of where they can get resources and where they can start. So let's see, Jim, are you still sharing your screen?
No, I shouldn't be.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Rather than prepare some slides and have a long discussions, what I thought I'd do is to think through some of the resources that are readily available to young scientists coming into the field. And in particular, what I have here is a list of references that span from the earliest period as samples had been returned and we were getting to understand the character of what Apollo was providing, and the integration through several decades, a total of about 40-something, 41 decades, or 41 years of background material. And what I'm showing here is there's several books, and actually, if you could scroll down to sort of look at the books at the bottom, yes. Here's a series of books that are readily available. All but the new views of the moon are available free for downloading. And I'd like to sort of walk through a little bit of the character of each of these and encourage the new generation of lunar scientists to start their own library, because they're all excellent, but quite different books that provide different character and different content. So if we could go back to the top, and I'll just sort of walk through it step at a time. The first, and I need to warn people, there are 3 tailors that are very active in lunar science. The first of which is Ross Taylor, who's no longer with us, but he is a wonderful person. He's what I would call everyone's grandfather of lunar science. He integrates things beautifully and is a master geochemist, and he puts the information that was acquired at the moon into the broader context of, well, what is the moon? How does it inform us as a planetary body? How is it related to the Earth? And he does it in a way that makes it sound simple, but he does it elegantly. And these first 4 books that I have with a little star by them all can be downloaded free from the website that I have up at the top. So if this can get sent to anyone who wishes, they're readily available. The second item, the origin of the moon, which, if you notice the date, was 1986. This was when the first concept of the major impact of a body into a proto-Earth spewed out material, which later formed the moon. And it was at a conference in the middle 80s on the origin of the moon that the community came together and really put these pieces together and said, yes, that clearly is the best origin of the moon model that we have. And has stood the test of time. It's been modified, as all models are, but it's really a landmark series of events that the community came together and recognized that, oh, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. But then, as you, I'm sure, know, through the years, it's been modified, and in the 2 bottom reviews, the New Views of the Moon 1 and New Views of the Moon 2, there are several chapters that again synthesize this in a way that makes wonderful sense. One of my favorites and that I've used extensively is the Wilhelms book. Don Wilhelms is one of the most accomplished lunar geologists. And he, sort of like Ross Taylor, integrates things in a manner with the intent to not only document, but to communicate clearly how things are put together. His geologic history of the moon, oh dear. That's my phone and it'll start, I'll be right back. Sorry. That he communicates and integrates things in a manner that is both visually clear, because he's a geologist and he uses a lot of images, but it makes a lot of sense. And if I encourage anyone, if you try to search for the geologic history of the moon and see if you can get a copy of this. I don't believe it's still being published, but you may be lucky and get a copy on the web that somebody has been cleaning out their library. But the Lunar Source book is another really useful book that again is completely available to download in the site that I provided, and it's not a book that you read end to end, but it's a book that you go to and say, well, what is the particle size of lunar regolith, or what is the variation in iron across the different sites? And you can find it in a nice table, very well organized. It's one of the key reference books when you want to find out some specific information. And it's just what the title says. It's a source book, and it's a guide to provide information as you would like. The ones I use the most, I think, are probably the Wilhelms and the Heiken source book, just because they're easy to use and find things readily. Now, the last two recommendations, unfortunately, you have to pay for. The four that I've provided there, you can easily download, just takes up space on your computer. But the New Views of the Moon, and here's the first one, is it has several chapters, and each chapters has multiple authors, and there's 17 years between the first New Views of the Moon and the second New Views of the Moon, which is very recent, actually. But in those 17 years, again, our understanding and the character of the data, not that we got any more additional lunar samples, we did recognize there are lunar meteorites, but that we have new techniques, new capabilities that have expanded our understanding in an enormous manner. So the sequence of these two compilations of our understanding of the moon from basically everyone who's been active in it had some chapter. One of the things, and I think I'll end on this, is in the first one, I was very pleased to be a co-author with Ross Taylor. And it was the last chapter in the New Views of the Moon book. But I'd like to read the last paragraph of this last chapter, because it shows how even people who are really the fathers of lunar science are humble and have good guidance. So here's the last paragraph, very short. Like most areas of science, discovery and progress in understanding how planets work is cyclical in nature. As valuable data are first acquired in one area, the information derived lays the foundation for all subsequent questions and the definition of new steps. And here's the last sentence. The danger, of course, is that our ignorance can never tell us what we have missed. We must make the best use of lessons learned. And that's an ongoing activity that I think everyone will be involved in. And that's all I have to say, but I'd look forward to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Carle. I'm really excited that you shared this list of books, because this is really a transfer of knowledge, and this is something that people can continue to do even after this event, is take a look at these sources.
I have to smile a little bit in that, and I don't know if you did this as well when you were young, but you know, when we were learning, we went to school, we had all these things we had to learn, and there was so much. And I said, well, why can't they just make a little something you could put under your pillow, and when you go to bed at night, it could just, you know, fill your brain. And of course that doesn't happen, but that was what my transfer of knowledge thought was at the time. It's a little,
do that.
It takes a little more effort.
Yes, but definitely worth it. Okay, I think we have a few questions already in the Q&A. Let me take a look. So I think we'll start. The first question is from an anonymous attendee. So they're asking, what Artemis mission number is your gut feeling of the next actual crewed landing? Artemis 4, 8, 11, etc. If either of you want to take a shot at that. Oh, I think Jim is muted. Divya, if you want to make sure that he can unmute. Okay, you should be able to unmute now, Jim.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
I was just going to say, Carle, you can answer that. I think I would say from my Apollo experience that the answer is to be determined. Each of the earlier Apollo missions were designed to test out different aspects. First the lunar module, the command module first on Apollo 7, on Apollo 8, leaving Earth's gravity field, on Apollo 9, essentially testing out the docking and rendezvous of the lunar orbiter, of the command module and the service module, and rendezvous and undocking, etc. Apollo 10 going to the moon, being able to go down towards the surface but not land, and then that set the stage for Apollo 11. So I think it's really TBD, and I don't mean that in a sense that nobody knows. It's just that, well, nobody does know, but it's a sequence of events that if it turns out that something doesn't work very well, or there's a better way to do it, then that will be adopted. Or maybe, gee, we did it right 3 times in a row, so we're ready to go. We don't need that 4th test mission. So I think it's really very much TBD, and that's actually very much the way it should be. It shouldn't be just lockstep, because the whole idea is we're doing something unusual, complex, and we need to learn how to do it. Okay, so that'd be my answer. I hope it's early.
However, we haven't been to the moon for, what is it now, 45 years. So 2 generations, really. And I agree with Jim. There should be some hesitancy there, that we don't know everything. We've never been to the polar areas. As Jim mentioned, the lighting conditions are going to be dramatic, deep shadows, and the sun will be on the horizon, so there'll be a part of the horizon that you're going to get blinded when you try to walk that direction. So there's going to be a whole new set of learning that's going to have to occur during the first mission at the South Pole, because it's a different environment that we haven't encountered before.
Definitely, I think we still have a lot to learn. So that's why hopefully one of these events can be useful for identifying the gaps in knowledge. Okay, so the next question. Oh, sorry, Jim, did you have something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to Carle. So, Carle, I'm surprised to hear you say we haven't been to the moon in over almost 50 years, because Carle always points out that yes, we have been to the moon. We have tons of missions to the moon, and we're learning so much, and it's related to the human exploration to optimize that. Okay, so I think Carle and I kid about this all the time. We come back, but it's really one cannot forget that complementarity of those data. These are the things that are going to help us better understand. We used limited site selection orbital data we had during Apollo for the Apollo landing site selection, but mostly it was, in fact, essentially lunar orbiter images. So it was and telescopic images. Actually, we landed on Apollo 15. Brace yourself. We landed with 20-meter image resolution images. Okay, 20-meter. Now, any engineer today would have cardiac arrest immediately, thinking about trying to land with 20-meter. But we did it, okay, because we knew some other areas around there and so on. So, but the orbital data is critically important.
Definitely. Okay, so the next question is from Katie Gainser. So Katie says, as you mentioned, Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were cancelled. And as an amateur Apollo historian, my understanding is that this was due to budget cuts. Once the novelty of landing on the moon wore off and the public generally lost interest. How confident are you that we will get beyond Artemis 3 this time, so we can actually do extensive in situ science this time? What do we as the next generation need to do to ensure that we continue once the public excitement of Artemis inevitably wanes? That's a big question.
I can start out, Carle, if that's okay.
Yep, please go ahead, Jim.
So I think 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, they were all out there planned. We had launch vehicles for 18, 19, at least 18 and 19, maybe 20. I can't remember right now. They're in various museums in various places now. But it wasn't so much that the public lost interest in it. It was more that there were other national priorities. Okay, so at that same time, I was at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I spent virtually every weekend, down on the mall protesting against Vietnam and Cambodia war, and with 100,000 of my closest friends, and so there were the cities were burning. It was like incredible. Okay, there were race riots, cities were burning, and Vietnam was raging, and that took a huge amount of money, and that was not just costing a lot of money budget-wise, but it was focusing people's attention. So I would say, right now we have a robust space program and the essentially Earth orbiting space program with the low Earth orbit space station, International Space Station. And that's not really on people's agenda. It's not really in their frame of reference. So I think you can sustain a planetary exploration conference, exploration program, and continue it at a relatively lower level. It's just that simply it can't take up a significant part of the national budget as well, Apollo never took up a significant part of the national budget. It just took up a lot more than it does now. I think one of the weaknesses in our society is the fact that we have these pesky elections where administrations are changing every 4 years or so, and that causes difficulty in long-term planning. We're also not really, I would say, very smart, if you will, as a culture and country about investment in the future. We don't put, I would say, the percentage of the national effort required to ensure our continued leadership in all areas of science and technology and space, et cetera, that we should. We don't think about things that way. We don't sit back and say, okay, look, here are the things we need to do. We're going to really make these investments. Don't mess with these, because this is clearly the case. And so we have the elections, and we have the lack of, I would say, strategic long-term planning and investment. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. And I think, a country like People's Republic of China, okay, they don't have those pesky elections, okay? And they're able to do long-term planning. They also have a culture that is much more long-term thinking, long-term planning. And so when they make a decision on these sorts of things, it'll be implemented. And you can see the Chang'e program. I mean, my gosh, look at all those successive missions, including far-side sample return and orbital assets to communicate. And that's a good example of that. So I think we can do it, but it's a question of, it's very hard to sustain for a couple of systemic reasons, not just the elections, but also our lack of focus on long-term investment. So, people ask me, is China, China's program to land humans on the moon, taikonauts on the moon, is scheduled for 2030. Okay, people ask me, well, wait, are they going to beat us back to the moon? And I said, well, I don't know. It's kind of like the tortoise and the hare. I don't know. The tortoise and the hare. I hope everybody knows that fable. Okay, maybe let's just be sure we're not sleeping under the tree. Okay, that's my point. Okay, so that's more than you wanted to know.
One thing, following up on that a little, Jim, the last election, when Mr. Trump was the previous president and Biden came in, the thing I was very encouraged by, specifically with NASA, was there was no big change of the program. That NASA and the return to the moon remained a priority. And to me, that was wonderful. That was it. Normally it does, oh, well, we've got to have our own program because it's ours now. But that transition of very dramatic change of leadership within NASA, the program remained focused, and that was very encouraging.
I think you're absolutely right about that, Carle. And I would say one of the reasons that is because space, among most of the issues that we discuss in this country politically, is in fact has bilateral support. And I think that's important. I think and we ought to build on that for sure. Unfortunately, though, given that, and of course, it in all modesty, it also helped that one of our former students was head of the transition team.
I know.
This is Ellen Stofan. But I think it's critically important to remember that, for example, just to pick up on one of my points a minute ago, is that now in the Deficit Reduction Act, okay, things are being pretty much cut across the boards, okay? And so, space science was cut several hundreds of millions of dollars this fiscal year, okay? So, that sounds like a little bit of sleeping under the tree, if you know what I mean, type thing. So, we'll see how that works out. I think, I think we need to do everything we can to get us out of this political gridlock, okay, because it's clear what's going to happen if that persists, okay,
Yeah, I think that's, very relevant for right now. We're in a very maybe not so unique situation. It's happened in the past, but yeah, definitely, yeah. Okay, so I think we'll move on to another question from Hunter. So Hunter asks, what do you think are some of the most repeated but least remembered lessons from Apollo?
I think, well, first of all, Apollo was flags and footprints. Okay, so it drives me crazy when people say that. And there's also another misconception. Oh yeah, Apollo astronauts were all scripted on the moon, because people have looked back in the past and seen the cuff checklists and seen some of the documents, and they misunderstand what that means. So the key there is that any of you who are geologists or scientists who go into the lab experimentally or just go out in the field, you never go without a plan. I mean, it's kind of like, oh, like I'm going to Antarctica. Okay, I've been in 5 seasons in Antarctica. You don't go down there without a plan. You don't even get approved to go down there without a plan. And when you have a plan, you know what you want to try to do. This does not mean that you never look for anything unknown. That's the whole point. It's about the exploration of the unknown. So the astronauts, you go back and listen to those transcripts. You'll see the excitement in Jack Schmidt's face with the orange soil. You see the excitement in Jack, see it in his face actually, and not really because he's got his mask on, but Dave Scott, you'll listen to that and hear him talk about the discovery of the green glass. I mean, these are green, all these kinds of seatbelt basalt, Genesis rock. I mean, all of these things are real discoveries. So I think that's something that to disavow yourself of too. And I think, one of a very general theme, I would say, when I was in 6th grade, okay, the teacher asked the question of the class, what's a better history? One that is written at the time of the events, or one that's written 50 years later? And I thought to myself, I answered the question. I said, well, it seems to me that if you wait 50 years, people will have forgotten, what happened, and nobody will have been around, except for maybe a few people who actually experienced it. So I would say the one that's written at the time. And she said, no. She said, the trouble is that there's too many biases and opinions about what should have happened or did happen or whatever at the time. You need to have perspective. And I let me just tell you that I've lived the 50 years to look back and see what people say now about Apollo. and I don't need to be right, but I think I was partly right that, if you look back 50 years from now, you see it too much in the lens of what you want to see. So, how can anybody look back and say it was just flags and footprints? How can anybody do that? But you do. So I think that's another really thing to think about, is that it's clearly a combination of the two. You want to read one from the time and you want to read one from later to get perspective. So that's one thing I would say.
Carly, did you have any lessons as well that you feel were least remembered but are most important?
No, it's to me, it's always a learning process. And I think what drives me is finding new things that you can build on. And there's always new things. I mean, you don't run out of new things. You just have to keep your eyes open and puzzle about things, and there'll be a gem in there. Sometimes you won't know until 10 years later, but.
Great, thank you. I think we have a raised hand. Amanda, I'm just gonna unmute you so you can ask your question. See if this works.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was raising my hand. This is
Okay, no
really,
worries.
this is really insightful, so I really appreciate it, and I do appreciate Jim's comment about continuing the dialogue and making this a long-term conversation rather than just like a one-time thing. So yeah, thank you, both of you.
Our pleasure.
Great.
We've got a question from Andrew Wilkowski. What do you think is the biggest wheel that needs to be reinvented for Artemis?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
What do you think is the biggest wheel that needs to be reinvented for Artemis?
Wheel that needs to be reinvented. I think the science and engineering synergism. I would say that's one that right now, I think that exists for sure, but it doesn't seem to be as much of a fundamental goal in the first place. Oh, let's get the science and engineers together. Lots of times you see the engineers say, okay, look, what are your requirements? Okay, now, they don't say go away, but what are your requirements? Okay, thank you. And then they'll go off and design something, but it needs to be really iterative. And I think that's the other thing is too, I would say that the way in which I mentioned the organization, the Apollo program versus the Artemis Moon to Mars architecture, the way things are done now with the competing of things like, okay, so the rover, okay, we set some requirements and then they go off and they do the whole thing. And then they come back and deliver it for us or, provide it. Same with the lander, et cetera. Then you don't have you have internal to that company, hopefully science and engineering synergism, but it has to be done in each one of these areas. And that works against the integrated NASA science and engineering synergism. So if you see what I mean, so you are delivered something, okay, and you don't work day to day every day to iterate that as they're designing it, okay. So that process of delivering first of all, there's a misconception that all the Apollo hardware was built inside NASA, and it's absolutely not the case at all. It's pretty much the way it is now. That was done by contractors, okay. Absolutely. Okay, the lunar module was built by one, the command module was built by another, the launch vehicle was built by others, and so on, some pieces and parts, et cetera. And I think that the integration of that together in the Apollo program was what really brought the science and engineers together. And then we talked about the requirements, we talked about how to implement them, we talked about where we would go from here, what's next, et cetera, what can we do next, and so on. How do we iterate? Can we evolve this piece of hardware here to something even better? Those things were done a little bit differently, and I think that's something that the science and engineering synergism, people really need to pay attention to making sure that happens, okay? Because I think it's not going to be so natural in Artemis.
Ali, did you have any comments on what wheel should be reinvented?
No, but I agree with Jim that the synergism between the engineering side of NASA and the science side really has to be meshed very closely. That gives the strength to the whole program. It can't be separate, one decision here, one decision without the links between the two.
Yeah, I would add to that too, just back to what you're saying, that another wheel that is let's just say is a little rusty as opposed to needing to be reinvented is the interaction of the Artemis Moon to Mars effort to outside scientists, okay? So in Apollo, there was a large structure of advisory committees, both academy committees, both committees within NASA, et cetera, who constantly reviewed. I spent a lot of my time reviewing traverses, reviewing the landing site options, et cetera. And that was really, really helpful and productive because you got outside opinions, and that is just critical in any effort. Things are being pulled into NASA a little more, it was certainly much more than they were in the past. And so I think that's okay, but you need to be sure about what you're doing there and not do it at the cost of the outside input and interaction. So, for example, I've heard it said, well, we can do everything kind of like internally to NASA now, because in Apollo they didn't have any scientists with NASA. Now we have a whole bunch of scientists, so we don't need so more of those outside people. And first of all, that's kind of like, I'm not sure that I've ever heard those exact words said, but the sense of it I've sensed. And there were tons of scientists, lots of scientists that had participated in the traverse planning and the site selection and mission operations, the data analysis, and so on at NASA. Among them, Carle. Okay, and so I think that it was really the outside perspective that really helped. It were people coming in from the outside, and this is always important in any endeavor, any kind of major institution, particularly one that's getting older with time, like NASA is, just a fact of life. Is even more needs to have outside, like a visiting committee kind of thing, come in and give them some perspective. So that would be another one. I would say it needs to be oil, not so much reinvented. Okay.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you for that. Okay, so we're on the hour now, or just past the hour. So we'll just do a couple more questions. I know, Jim, you had something to go to. So if at all you need to
I have plenty of time. I don't have
okay.
to go to the Mars 10 organizing committee till 3.
Okay, okay, great. So if you both want to continue, then we can continue with the questions that we have.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So we have another question. This is more talking about the orbital data. So an anonymous attendee asks that there is an immense amount of orbital data available now for the South Polar region, more than was available for the Apollo sites during the mission planning phases. How do you see the mission planning phase changing or being different now that we have such a great diversity of data for the moon's surface? So they give examples of geochemistry, mineralogy, temperature, gravity, in addition to the optical imagery.
Let me take a first stab at that. All those things that you listed come at different resolutions and different coverages. So getting them together in a coordinated manner so you can do some serious evaluation of a site takes a lot of work. But within current technology, that's common. It's readily a way of working with data. So part of the real issue, in my view, is, well, which kind of orbital data do you want to obtain to address which kind of problem? And that's sort of a mapping of capabilities, what's possible, what's not possible. So it's not just, well, let's go get higher resolution images. That'd always be nice. We always learn something, but let's get a diversity of measurements that gives us not so much a sense of being on the surface, but more information about the surface so that we can make good judgments in terms of how to plan activities. That's my short form.
I would agree 100% with Carle, as almost always. No, it's Carle and I tease each other a lot. So I think it's really critically important to think about the South Circumpolar region, the Artemis landing area of interest that we're going to here, because it's it's not just about the high resolution data, it's about what we know about the context that provides too. So this is why we did this South Circumpolar geological map, okay, high resolution geological map. It's the Krasilnikov et al. It's an Icarus paper. And because what we did was we did a geological map, okay, and we in fact were able to map out things, look at stratigraphic sequence, do crater size, frequency distribution, ages on the units, put them in order, and then look and see what the superposition was, what the stratigraphic columns were likely to be. And as you might expect in the South Circumpolar region, you're not at Apollo 11, you're not at Apollo 12, 15, 16, or 15 or 17, where you have Maria, you have distinctive mountain ranges, and you can go, okay, let's do this, look at that. It's really I would say, a bouillabaisse or a potpourri, okay? Because it's just dominated by South Pole Aitken Basin. It's dominated by dozens of subsequent large impacts. And the key is going to be in the stratigraphic column. If you got extremely high resolution, spectral reflectance data across a wide range of spectral range, I'm not sure we even know what to do with it, okay, in the sense of being able to interpret it beforehand. What we do need to know, and that's why I encourage you to read those two papers, is look at the stratigraphy of these individual sites. And the second paper, which is coming out soon, has literally the stratigraphic column for each of the Artemis sites of interest, because that shows what's going on in terms of the stratigraphy, what's overlapping. And this is going to help us to do our analyses of sample selection, okay, sample understanding the context for sample provenance, that's where they came from. This is going to be really hard here. It's really going to be hard. And I think what we really need to do is think about this and think about new tools to assist the astronauts in their distinguishing of these things, okay? So they're going to be looking at breccias. It's going to be all breccias, folks, okay? So and when they do that, you're going to be looking for distinctive things, okay? You're going to be looking for typical things, but also distinctive things. So we need to find the tools that that will assist them in distinguishing various types of things. For example, what kind of remote sensing handheld instrument would blink a red light when you had olivine in abundance in a sample, okay? I'm sure there's one, okay? So that's the kind of thing you need. You need things like that in terms of, is it plagioclase? Are there other things? Look for radioactive elements. I mean, all these. So this is the kind of tools that are going to be needed. This is much more important to me than getting even higher resolution data at the present time. As Carle says, the high resolution data will help, but we really need to have something to help us sort out sample selection in fact, the potpourri, the bouillabaisse that is going to be the South Circumpolar region. And also, this is going to be even more important because, I showed that slide of the abundance of samples and an increase in samples return between Apollo 11, 12, 14, and then 15, 16, 17. And, due to various design inheritances, the spacecraft, the orbital spacecraft, the return capsule, is likely to be limited to about 50 kilograms of return lunar samples, okay, per mission. And that's about what Apollo 11, 12, and 14 brought back. And we're going to be doing so much more than that. And so that's another thing. That's another thing I would say that needs to be worked on, in the program to quadruple that, for crying out loud. How can we be bringing back more than we brought back 50 years ago? Less than we brought back. We ought to be bringing back a lot more. So that's another challenge, and that's an engineering challenge. And maybe we do sample. Maybe we have a fleet of robotic sample return missions. Okay, maybe the lander will be large enough to be able to shovel a hole. Something for everybody. But we need to work on that.
One of one of the things that I've been puzzling about ever since their South Pole was designated as the Artemis landing site is, unlike Apollo, where the sun was high, the sun's going to be on the horizon. And you're going to have a way of, whenever you have to go in that direction, you're going to be blinded. Think of, heading into the sunset and how, you have to pull things down in your car to blink out your eyes. Just functional, there's going to be directions that the astronauts can't easily maneuver to. They'll have to have other ways of getting around because they'll be blinded by the sun that's right on the horizon. And it may be you'll have to do, cross, go this way, then go that way, then, it's what you do when you ski, but it's not like Apollo.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And also just highlighting an opportunity in terms of lunar mapping. There's actually a call out for a lunar mapping geologic team that they're looking for. And as early career members, you can apply as a graduate student to that opportunity, which is very exciting. We'll send out a link to that as well. So that's one way to actually get actively involved in this effort to make geologic maps of the moon for Artemis. Okay, great. And I think we have some more questions. I think we have a question from Sean. What were some of the methods the Apollo team used to quickly iterate on new knowledge gained between Apollo missions? To say it another way, it seems very daunting to keep a tight mission schedule while also updating mission plans in light of new information.
Yeah, I think that there were several different avenues there. We were always carrying along 2 or 3 candidate landing sites for the next mission if we hadn't already selected it. But we try to keep it open in a sense of like what the results from the previous one were. But sometimes that was less relevant. But iteration was critically important. That was both for the scientific goals and objectives, as well as site selection, as well as traverse planning. And of course, the astronauts themselves had fantastic experience. Each of the missions had fantastic experience. So when they came back, we would debrief them. Okay. The funnest one was in the basement of Mission Control, where we would several of us with the crew, the people who had worked with training them instead of the geology group and so on, would get together with them, and it was just amazing. It's kind of like a not recorded kind of like discussion, and they would watch themselves on the moon, and it was hysterical but we learned huge amounts from that, and we would factor that back in about what to do, what to not to do, how to work better as a team. They would watch themselves, et cetera, and then the backup crew would be there too, and oftentimes the crew from the subsequent mission would be there as well. And then there were the formal debriefings, where literally the astronauts sat there, they were given a bunch of questions, they were asked a bunch of questions from all the different operations people, et cetera. That was also extremely useful, and those are all available to look at as well. Yeah, it was very iterative. The other thing, from the sample point of view, I was on the preliminary examination team from a number of the missions, where, working with the scientists who took unpacked the rocks, did the initial descriptions of them, and then put together a catalog so that people from the exterior would know what to be able to apply for. So we had all the transcripts, we had why we collected it there, we had the documentation of the collection, and we had the samples and the description of the samples. And that was a catalog which they used to apply for the samples for more detailed analysis in their labs. And that was really important too, because we were right in there with the people who were doing the analysis. We were doing the planning. We were both doing the describing, like literally shoulder to shoulder. And that was extremely useful as well. So all of these things went into the planning of the future missions, the subsequent missions. Yeah.
Did you have anything to add during your experience as a graduate student, seeing the the new results each time they came out from Jim?
No, but as a graduate student, that was a thrilling times. Actually, no, let me back up a little. Between my undergraduate and my graduate, I went into the Peace Corps and was assigned to Malaysia, and in particular on the island of Borneo. That's when we landed on the moon. And the school system, I was teaching science to sort of 7th and 8th graders. The school system beyond the primary was taught in English, and that's a carryover from the British when they were in the area, which was a wise thing because the Malaysians are basically 3 primary races, Malay, Chinese, and a local, and approximately equal. And each of them have their own language, their own culture. So to go from primary school to secondary school, you had to have English because the secondary schools were taught in English as a compromise. It wasn't anybody's specific language. And when we landed on the moon, we had a radio and the students were just enthralled. Here's people landing on the moon. And what they enjoyed most, now remember, they had to learn English as a second language, was Armstrong, Armstrong, Armstrong. It just made it very real. And it's not something that I would have thought of, but to them, you know, a strong arm was what you needed. It was a delight.
That sounds like an incredible experience. Yeah. Great. Okay. I think Divya, did you want to pick one of the questions next? I put you on the spot, sorry.
So there's one question from an anonymous attendee again. The Chinese Space Agency has plans for crewed exploration for the moon in the coming decades, in addition to the NASA's Artemis program, to Moon, to Mars, and to architecture, not to mention recent and upcoming robotic sample return missions in the Chang'e program. How do you see these efforts fitting in or not to NASA's architecture?
Well, let's see. The current robotic program, the Chang'e program, and the follow-on International Lunar Research Station will be in the polar circumpolar regions. That is to say, the 7 and let's see, what are we? 6 is to land in Apollo Basin in soon, in mid in a few weeks. Okay, sorry. I always have trouble with time. I say this all the time, but I'm a geologist, and time doesn't kick in until 20 million years. So I'm always today. What's who knows? Who knows? Anyway, so the Chang'e 7 and 8 missions will be landing in the circumpolar regions, and they're very, very fascinating experimental missions, which have a whole range of experimental spacecraft on them, and experimental, 3D printing, all sorts of trying out different technologies, et cetera. And then following that will be the International Lunar Research Station, which will be more dedicated attempts. Currently, it's an international. So I attended the last meeting in Hefei in last April in Hefei, China, and it there's a dozen or so different countries are engaged in that, and I think so. Those are all the robotic programs. The human program, it's not at all clear. That's very different. Okay, it's very different. It's the Taikonaut program, and it's sort of like human. It's sort of like our essentially robotic exploration part of NASA, of SMD, and then it's the human exploration part. So they're not exactly the same, but it's under the same umbrella. And broadly speaking, it's the same with CHINSA. the human program is more under the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, but that's a structure thing. And so the activities there, the spacecraft are being built and tested. They will be going more likely to be going to equatorial mid-latitude landing sites, in my opinion, than they will be going to polar landing sites initially. So that's a long-winded answer to the question, how do they fit? I think they'll be very complementary in the broadest sense like that as well. And it's like we say, I mean, the moon is actually a pretty big place, okay? And we have never returned samples from well over one half the moon, the far side, et cetera. And so, I'm really excited. It would be ridiculous and completely unlikely for us to be landing in the same place. I mean, it's just there's no reason for that. There's no scientific logical reason. There's no international reason. There's no, so I think it's going to be really complementary, and I'm all in favor of that, because we need all the help we can get to understand the origin and evolution of the moon and its implications for the rest of the solar system.
Well, sort of following up on that, Jim, too, going back to the Apollo era, that the Russians did several robotic sample return, and there's exchange of samples between what was then the Soviet Union and the U.S. and that worked well. Everyone was, at least within the science part of it, very congenial. And Jim was a key person in getting a lot of some of the agreements moving forward with the U.S. community and the Russian community. So it was done before, and it will probably be done again.
Yeah, I think we face a particular challenge that we did not during the U.S.-Soviet era. Of course, there was incredible competition and national security issues, just as there are today in any kind of international space endeavor. But we never had what we have in the United States now, which is the Wolf Amendment, which is a federal law that prohibits the interaction, prohibits the spending of NASA funds on Chinese-U.S. interactions by investigators funded by NASA, et cetera. So that's I mean, that's the federal law. That's the federal law. That's all you need to say about that. Okay, so you're going to obey that law. It was done by Congressman Wolf on the basis of his concern about human rights violations with the Uyghurs in China, a very real concern. And he put it in as a rider on I think it was an appropriations bill, which typically didn't get the debate, et cetera, that you would usually have in any kind of major national policy guideline. And I think, it had unintended consequences, and I think that it means that we're a little bit handcuffed in that sense. But to be sure, there are details in that law which show that there can be made exceptions to the specific interactions. NASA can petition Congress, which they've done several times in the past. And I think the good news is they have Administrator Bill Nelson petitioned Congress on behalf of NASA to permit U.S. investigators to apply to the Chinese Space Agency to ask for Chang'e 5 samples, which have been returned from the moon. And that was allowed. And, several investigators, foreign investigators and U.S. investigators funded by NASA have been interviewed. We're all still awaiting the results from that. But that's a good sign. That's a really good sign, because it's not just kind of like, completely divided. And my hope is that, clearly China will be returning samples from Mars in the future, as we will, as the U.S. will, and I hope we'll be in a position to share those as well. I think, we can all only benefit from that.
And I'm very encouraged with the developments that's gone on recently in that regard, that it hasn't said, okay, no, the door is closed. It's, yeah, it's open. You just got to be careful and do it correctly.
And you can't be, let's all be clear here. We can't be naive about international competition and also technological and defense-related competition. You know, the thing about space is it's a dual-use effort. So the technology that's developed can be used both in the military and civilian space. And so that is actually good because we get a lot of benefits from things developed in the military space when they're declassified. But at the same time, we have to be careful and not naive at all to think that, you know, that some of the things that we do might be better left unshared or whatever from a technological point of view. You know, you just have to be really careful about that. And there are very distinct rules about that. And please don't let anybody be naive about, oh, we don't have to pay attention to this. That is the first thing you need to do in any kind of these international cooperation and collaboration kinds of thoughts. Okay, so I don't mean to be preaching about that, but it's really important. It's really critically important.
We've got this question from anonymous attendees. It's directed to Jim. Jim, you mentioned the astronauts in the Apollo era being primarily test pilots, but that isn't the case for Artemis or modern astronauts, where many have advanced degrees in STEM in addition to pilot experience. What adjustments do you think that makes for astronaut training in the lead up to Artemis landings on the moon?
I think it's all good. I mean, I think, make no mistake, in the Apollo days, frankly speaking, if I had the opportunity to go along as a passenger on an Apollo mission, there's no way you would have wanted to have made me the pilot. Okay, these are the people who have been through, you know, as test pilots, taking brand new machines of various kinds and putting them through their paces and testing them out. And that takes, it's not just courage. Courage is required, but it's also, you know, that thing we talked about with situational awareness. It's a thing about, you know, being able to actually do a lot of things at once and do them very well, et cetera. So, you know, it's frankly speaking, I would appreciate having a pilot as a commander because in fact they have that, well, you know, in the old days they would call it the right stuff, but it's a combination of these things. It's not has nothing to do with really macho. It has to do with being able to do these kinds of things instantly. Okay. You know, I just to recall, I was driving with a friend of mine, a former girlfriend of mine, and Dave Scott, the commander, in the passenger seat. And I was in the back seat. You know, we were taking it up at Brown. We were driving along the street, and I see this person back out into the street, and I am sure that they don't see us and they're going to hit us. And the woman driving was talking. And I knew she wasn't paying attention to that. And I'm about ready to go and lurch forward and go for the wheel. And the guy continued to pull out, but just missed us. And I said, "Oh, Jesus, Dave, that was close." And he turned around and he said, "Jim, wasn't going to happen." So think about that. He's clocking his whole thing, talking to my friend, blah 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 blah, this, and you know, and he has calculated the trajectory and the interaction and the forward speed, the lateral speed, and he knows it's okay. It's not wasn't going to happen, you know. Whereas I'm in the back seat panicking, you know what I mean? So yeah, I should stay in the back seat and get out and do some, you know. So, but no, it's great. I mean, the new crews, and I've been fortunate enough to work with each of the crews, and the new classes that they come in, they're just fantastic. They're fabulous. I mean, just fabulous, just fabulous. They come up to Brown for training sometimes. We have an immersive virtual reality facility, and it's just been a blast. So yeah, they're going to be great.
Carle, did you have anything to add for this question?
No, I'm just enjoying it as we move along.
Yeah. I think we'll do one more question and then we'll wrap things up, if that's okay with you too. So last question is a bit of a topic change, but I thought it would be interesting and important to discuss, as this is what's different about Artemis as opposed to Apollo, the involvement of industry. So the question is, in your opinion, is the strong involvement and responsibility of industry in the development of future robotic missions the optimal way to implement lunar scientific research over the next few years?
I think you're referring to the commercial lunar payload services. Okay, yeah, specifically. I mean, industry is involved at all levels, and they always have been. Okay, in these programs, obviously. I think the idea of developing commercial payload services to the moon. I mean, you know, I think it's fairly safe to say that the sense is it's like a Federal Express to the moon. Okay, you pay the money and they deliver your product to wherever it is you want it to go. In this case, the destination is the moon. I think that's a good thing. I think that's really going to be beneficial in the future. And you can already see that some of these companies are getting contracts to do small set, kind of like missions to Mars, for example. Astrobotics just got a contract like that. That's going to be fantastic. Okay. So that means that people like NextGen are going to be able to design experiments and conceptualize them, design them, maybe even build them, maybe even fly them in the course of a several-year graduate career. And I think that's great. We're in a shakedown phase now, so you know, let's just say it's risky to be experiments on the first few missions because you know we've never done it before. The Ranger program, ask what happened to Ranger 1 through 6. We couldn't hit the moon, for Christ's sake. Okay, so you know that's always a problem. And I think that's part of the cost of doing business and part of being in space, that failure happens, and it's a learning process. And clearly that's what's going on here. So I'd rather have them all be successful, but that would be really naive. And I think you know, we're seeing the shakeout of that process. I am involved in an experiment. The dimple experiment, which is to in situ date material on the INA feature to see if it's 38 million or 3.5 billion. And that's manifested on a CLIPS mission that'll be flying in about 2027. And I'm hoping, you know, that things are going to get worked out here, and we'll have a series of providers in the next year or so, in which case, you know, we'll be really in good shape, because it's absolutely, I think, the way to go. I think it's also clear that it gives you the opportunity to fly experiments that don't necessarily have anything to do with specific places on the moon. At the same time, it gives you the opportunity to fly a suite of payloads that is like, for example, Reiner Gamma. What's up with Reiner Gamma? We don't really know. And so, you know, a dedicated mission there, or Tyson domes and things like that. So I think it's a good way to go. It just, you have to be patient isn't quite the right word. You have to be understanding, well, patient and understanding, in the sense that failure is often a part of the process. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to highlight again, is that there are going to be failures, and we're not used to that. We're not prepared for that. And I found it fascinating when the mission that fell over on its side was well discussed. You know, it was okay. Well, it just laid. You know, it wasn't called a failure, but it was a learning situation, and you know, that was one of the more benign ways to have a failure, because it still landed there. But nothing. We shouldn't expect perfection, or we should work towards perfection, but we should have a mechanism that allows us to continue to move forward on an alternate plan when necessary.
I would just add to that too. I think, if there is a downside, it's the following two things. One, because NASA is tasking them to do a certain thing and then letting them loose and letting them do it their way, then there is less oversight. Okay. And I think that's, I worry a little bit about that just because NASA has a huge amount of experience in this area in terms of providing oversight and advice and things like that. And I worry a little bit that there may be a higher failure rate because that's part of the system. The second thing is that, these are all industrial entities, and so they're all competitive with one another. And so while Carle is correct that there was good discussion of what happened, et cetera, they're not likely to share the details of their failure modes, et cetera, because that's company confidential in a way. It's company sensitive. It's company, competitive. Right? And so, I think in a way that a little bit works against us too, in the sense that we might have, if we pool the resources of understanding from a whole variety of NASA and companies, et cetera, we might be able to solve the problem more efficiently. But that's not the way the process works. So those are just two things to, we don't want to be Pollyannish about this. I mean, there's some pluses and minuses, and I think the pluses far outweigh the minuses, but we need to be thinking about those things too.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion. I hope we can keep speaking about all of these topics in future events. And I just want to thank our speakers. I think we'll start wrapping up now. If either of you have any lasting remarks that you want to make, please feel free.
Well, I'd just say I'm on top here, so I'll just go first, and at least in the way I'm seeing these things here. So no, I think this is a really important dialogue. I mean, I hope neither of us come across as being preaching at all. It's not. I think go back to Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes. So, what are the themes here? What are the things to carry forward to think about? These are not orders. They're just ideas. Hey, this worked. 50 years, we can improve that. We better be able to improve it. I'd like to end by one last comment here too, which I think is, NextGen has a real challenge here. Okay, so when I was in Apollo, it was in the late 60s, the 60s. Okay, and these were different times. They were very different times. Unfortunately, as exemplified by the race riots, racism was a cancer in our society. It still is, but things have gotten a lot better. Well, they've gotten better, I'll say. And also sexism. It wasn't like we were like anti-women. It was just that's the way it was. And I think you have to appreciate that, those cultural environments are just the way they were. Okay, and that doesn't excuse them, but it says, don't go back and demonize Apollo because it was done primarily with males. So my challenge to you, NextGen, if you think Apollo was a success, make it 100% better, because you now have 50% more of the population and women and minorities and gender diverse people, et cetera. So the challenge is, hey, you've got a whole gang there, okay, that can make this even better. So do it, okay?
Definitely, I
Well
appreciate that. Carle, did you have any lasting remark that you wanted to make?
No, this has been a joy and a real pleasure to be interacting with you on this. And again, like I say, the concept of transferring knowledge doesn't really work that way. We're all in this together and learning as we go. So let's move forward.
And keep iterating. It's really important. We're both here to help, and you just call on us anytime, and I'm happy to do the Apollo sequence of events, a talk on that, or like, okay, so what changed with each mission? How do we do that? And how did that optimize? And what are the lessons for Artemis? So things like that. I'm happy to do that. Okay, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of our panelists and to all of our attendees who asked questions. Apologies we didn't get to all the questions, but hopefully we'll be having another event like this one. And please bring your questions again, and hopefully we can get to them then as well.
And you have our emails too, so don't hesitate to email us as well. So not a problem. Okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, and we'll be sharing the event recording as well. We'll email it out to our mailing list, and it'll be posted on our YouTube channel. We'll also share the reading list that Carle spoke about, and the link to the lunar mapping opportunity for senior graduate students. So thank you everyone for attending. And yeah, I just want to thank our speakers again. Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye.